The soft groans of the ill could be heard all throughout the building. The smell, the wretched, ghastly smell of death, filled the air, clinging to every surface and filling every space. 14. That was the 14th person lost this week. The doctor stared down into his recently departed patient's eyes, only to be met with the cold and lifeless gaze he had become so accustomed to as of late. Just days before, this man was full of energy and life. What was he? A builder? A baker? The doctor racked his brain thinking of the answer, only to realize he couldn't even remember the man's name. With all his recent experiences, each patient had become a blur, a seemingly distant memory just out of his grasp. Ugh. The doctor groaned as he closed his eyes for a moment, his head pounding and aching as he had not slept in over 2 days. He thought back to his time in Egypt. He spent years studying medicine at the greatest universities in Alexandria, learning from the most experienced and highly acclaimed physicians. What good did that do him now? Almost all of his patients over the past week were dead. Useless, the doctor thought. Completely useless. His head pounding away, pulsating almost rhythmically with the beating of his heart. Suddenly, the doctor lurched forward in pain. He felt hot and sick. As the pain started to become more prominent, the man became more aware of what he was feeling in his body. The pulsating pain had spread. It was no longer confined to just his head. It had now become manifest elsewhere. The neck, in his armpits. As he reached his hand over to feel for the telltale sign of the pestilence, his heart sank as he felt a large protruding lump under his shirt. While he was busy trying to treat his dying patients, he had not noticed that he had become the plague's next victim. Unrelenting, unyielding. As the city of Constantinople was consumed by the icy grip of the plague, doctors of all manners would find their efforts fruitless. Day after day, thousands of people of all walks of life would be struck ill, and physicians would find themselves with a seemingly compounding number of patients, all of their lives hanging by the thinnest of threads and with no sign of respite. The Byzantines had 3 stratifications of physicians. The best and most experienced were aristocratic and employed by the imperial court. Second were public doctors paid by the city. And last were private practitioners. The way these physicians practiced medicine was based on a theory that would remain in use until the advent of germ theory in the mid-1800s, the humoral theory of disease. Essentially, the theory stipulated that a person's health was determined by 4 bodily fluids called humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. It's believed that the 4 humors needed to be in balance, and if a person were experiencing some sort of affliction, their humors were out of balance. Physicians attempted to diagnose which humor would be out of balance and then prescribe treatments to rebalance the humors. Often, this would include treatments we are all familiar with, such as bloodletting or induced vomiting, but it would also include more mild treatments such as dietary changes, ice baths, and the prescription of different herbs or remedies. While the latter 3 treatments sound reminiscent of modern healthcare, the treatment regimen did not have any evidence-based medicinal benefit and could at times be harmful to patients. In spite of all their years of training at the great universities of Alexandria, and in spite of all their experience, Byzantine physicians would find these treatments and their efforts futile. While it may be tempting to describe these practices as primitive, it is important to understand that these treatments, while ineffective, were likely based on legitimate observations, and that humoral theory correctly identified the cause of disease as something natural, a concept which was unprecedented at its advent, as the majority of the world would have thought that diseases would have been caused by punishment from the gods. This would be a crucial stepping stone to the development of our modern healthcare understanding. The sheer scale of new patients each day left tens of thousands of people in Constantinople without access to a physician. Many would instead turn to their faiths. The terrified people of the city would wear jewelry thought to have magical properties or use powders blessed by saints. These gestures would prove to be just as useless as the bloodletting. In contrast to their medical practices, the organization of the Byzantine healthcare system appeared to be far closer to our modern healthcare doctrine. Healthcare infrastructure got its start with the ascendance of Christianity and the Christian desire to create shelters for the homeless. As time went on, the church and philanthropists had funded the creation of hospices and medical centers called nosocomions. By Justinian's reign, nosocomions could be found all over the cities of the empire. Like our hospitals today, they would offer their patients private rooms and do their best to ensure patients were comfortable while ill. Nosocomions would also feature separate sections for different categories of illness, akin to different departments in a modern hospital. When the plague struck, nosocomions provided consolidated locations where they could attempt to deal with the plague. Early on, Justinian recognized the importance of the nosocomion and would transfer court physicians and funding to supplement their efforts. In spite of their valiant attempts, the nosocomions and their physicians were almost immediately overwhelmed. Many physicians would bravely carry on every day to treat their patients in spite of the hopelessness of their situation. Many of these physicians would also end up meeting the same horrifying and painful end as those they were treating. With doctors inaccessible, many people turned to their superstitions and formulated all kinds of ideas as to what the cause of this all was. Many believed it was caused by a lingering miasma in the air, a toxic cloud produced by rotting flesh. Others believed this was simply the wrath of God. Regardless, townspeople found themselves self-isolating for fear of being struck with the plague, and on the occasion they did need to leave their homes, they would wear a name tag on their bodies in case they happened to drop dead. In spite of all containment efforts, the plague still ran its course, infecting and manifesting necrotic buboes before its victims expired. As the days went by, more and more bodies began to pile up across hospitals, churches, and graveyards. The stench of decay floods his nose. The nausea rolls through him as body after body gets tossed into the dirt. Too many for one grave, he thought with bitterness and pain. The town's hysteria is critical. Festivals and games have stopped and no one is coming outdoors. The pestilence is tearing its way through the city and its families at an alarming but methodical rate. Did you hear? Someone asks a nearby cluster of workers preparing bodies for the resting place. People are fleeing the country. Better air, they said. Clutching his cross and muttering a prayer of salvation, he gets back to work, blessing the dead before they are moved. He takes a moment to look out across at what seems like an endless wasteland, mass graves dotting the landscape all the way to the horizon. May God have mercy on us all. The pits have been dug deeper into the earth, but soon they will be full. There has been a significant loss of life already and the government was not prepared. If this is all they can handle, what are they to do if it gets worse? The workers continue their labor, casually tossing the bodies into the pit, occasionally pushing them down with their feet to make room for more. The callousness of the gravediggers is going against the very nature of the Lord. We are throwing salt on the earth and expecting it not to bleed into our hearts. We are corroding ourselves into damnation. The bodies are not being granted the respect they deserve for them to find peace. The faceless and anonymous condemnation of their immortal souls is bad enough, but stepping on them is disgraceful. The father closes his eyes with regret. How are we to expect this disease to not claim our souls when they are spitting in the very face of God over our treatment of the dead? How can anyone possibly recover from this ordeal with their humanity intact? The bodies of the dead continued to accumulate. The Christian nation considered cremation to be a pagan taboo at this time, and the city folk were instead buried. Cemeteries and churchyards quickly ran out of space, and the empire had a serious problem disposing of the dead. Justinian ordered his armed forces to assist the church in the digging of mass graves outside the walls to bury the thousands of dead citizens that were continually accumulating day after day. End-of-life processes had switched from being a religious rite to a state-run emergency response. Hundreds would be buried in any space that could accommodate them, and the numbers of people filling the mass graves began to overtake the numbers digging them. Many of those who dug the graves would soon find themselves joining the dead in their final homes. As with the traditional graves, the mass graves soon became filled to the point that soldiers had to step on the bodies to pack them in, seemingly turning the burial sites into horrific wine presses found all around the city. The number of dead became so overwhelming that the city began packing thousands of bodies within the massive towers of the Theodosian walls which dotted Constantinople's perimeter. A putrid stench of decay and rotting flesh quickly filled the air, lining every breath and strangling those who had not already had their lives snuffed out by the plague. Many of the living would soon find themselves also afflicted, the walking dead, sentenced to a week of agonizing torture before finding themselves eternally condemned to a muddy pit amongst their wives, husbands, siblings, parents, children, and fellow citizens, heading shoulder to shoulder to nameless, faceless anonymity as they too became part of the continually compounding, putrid malodor that was growing day by day. Ancient sources claim that upwards of 10,000 people were dying every day in the city of Constantinople alone. This is likely an over-exaggeration, and the true death toll will never be known, but modern historians estimate that the city of Constantinople would have been losing between 1 and 5,000 people every day for over 100 days. The plague would kill between 20 to 40% of the city's population, and thousands more would flee the city as refugees, cutting its population drastically. It would make its way across the city, infiltrating every store, stadium, dock, and home. It would make its way into stately palaces and churches, ignoring any barrier and guards. It would even make its way into the imperial quarters and wreak its havoc on the highest office in the land. On next week's episode, join us as we explore the imperial response to the plague. In what ways did it affect the imperial office? What were the enemies of the empire doing during this time? How did they take advantage of the situation? To find out, tune in next week to Contagions. Be sure to subscribe to stay tuned and like the video to help the channel grow. Over on Patreon, your host Sean Sharp will be regularly posting content that delves deeper into some of the subjects we would like to explore further but don't have time for on the YouTube channel. Go check it out and become a patron for more content and to support the channel. That's it for us today. We'll catch you next time, viewer.